Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. And today we're going back to the Eastern Mediterranean, back to the Hittite Empire, to look at what several of my sources call the earliest naval battle in recorded history, the Battle of Alashiya between 1275 and 1205 BCE. Now wait a minute. We told a war story about a naval battle last time when Ramses II kicked the Sheridan pirates' asses for raiding his ships in 1278 BCE. How could this be the first one? That's a good question, and I'm glad you asked, because it shows one of the frustrating things about studying pretty much anything from the Bronze Age. This stuff happened so long ago, and the records are so fragmentary that we don't always know what they mean. I told the Sheridan story as a sea battle, but all we really know is that the Sheridan were attacking ships, and then they weren't. And Ramses had a new unit of Sheridan in his bodyguard. It's possible that they attacked Egypt by sailing up into the Delta, or even up into the Nile proper and attacking cities on the river. Ramses might have trapped their ships on the river or gotten troops in between their ships and their land forces, or both, and beaten them that way. A fight like that wouldn't have required a sea battle, or even seagoing ships, at least for the Egyptians. That's why I try to be careful to tell y'all when I'm making up the war story and how much detail I've had to add to make it interesting. Because some of these war stories would be very short if I only told you what we know. And if you want it short, you'd be watching somebody else. So how do we know this battle is really a sea battle? Well, the records of the last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, tell us it was. At least that's what some really smart archaeologists tell us, and I have no reason to believe otherwise since they're the ones who know how to read ancient Hittite inscriptions. If they say this is the first naval battle we know of, then so it is. And that's about as good an intro as any to talk about ships and naval warfare in this part of the Mediterranean. Last time we talked about land battles at sea. This is an age before the Greeks developed triremes and the bronze rams that made them so powerful in ship-to-ship combat. Those ships won't show up for a few centuries yet. But it looks like in the 1200s BCE, the land kingdoms of the Near East and the island kingdoms of the Mediterranean started coming into conflict more and more often. These conflicts are going to come to a head in the 1100s when the so-called Sea Peoples start migrating out of the Med and into Anatolia, the Levant, North Africa, even Mesopotamia. We call that period the Bronze Age collapse, and it's pretty much the dividing line between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And for a while we blamed it on the migration of the Sea Peoples. But these days it seems more likely that whatever the Sea Peoples were migrating away from was also affecting the kingdoms of the Levant and Anatolia. Anyway, the collapse, or at least the military side of it, is going to take a bunch of war stories for us to get through. And I guess you could really consider this war story and maybe the one with the Sheridan the beginning of that period, even though the old Bronze Age kingdoms won those fights, because they show us that the conflicts between the old kingdoms and the Sea Peoples were already getting started in the early 1200s. And after all, the guy who won today's battle is going to be the last king of the Hittite Empire, one of the old kingdoms we've been talking about that went down in the collapse. Great. But I told you I was going to talk about naval warfare, so let's keep doing that. So we said this battle was before triremes and rams and ships sinking each other in combat. Instead, ship-to-ship combat in the 1200s and 1100s BCE probably looked a lot like land combat. Ships would have to pull up next to each other, hook up with grappling hooks and lines, board, and fight hand-to-hand. Of course, you'd have archers shooting arrows across the gap, probably trying to take out the captain and the key officers, maybe sending fire arrows to burn sails and rigging, and if they could get lucky, the ship itself. But fire arrows are probably unusual because in order to light a fire arrow and start a fire on the other guy's ship, you have to already have a fire on your ship. You'd try to make sure it was contained in something like a brazier or another metal container, but accidents happen, And ships until about the 19th century, this is like 150 years ago, were made out of wood. And wood burns. And if a couple of layers of wood is the only thing between you and drowning, you don't want fire anywhere near that shit. So you'd almost always have a land battle at sea. And it'd almost always be a bigger ship chasing and boarding a smaller ship, because a bigger ship's sides are higher, which makes it easier to board a smaller ship from a larger, and it can carry more Marines to do the fighting. And a bigger ship is going to have more rowers too, which means it's probably faster, at least in a straight line. But the rowers probably won't be doing much of your fighting. Their job is to close with the enemy ship, but you don't want them dropping their oars to jump on the other ship and fight, because you want to be able to get the hell out of there if you need to. So the rowers are probably just poor bastards, maybe even slaves who don't do anything but row. Not Marines, not soldiers. They are the ship's propulsion system. And as long as they stick to their role, they're probably not in much danger from boarders either, because the boarders probably don't want to sink a perfectly good warship. Much better to capture it and add it to their fleet. But there is a moment where the poor bastards at the oars are very much in danger, when the enemy slides up alongside. Because if they don't get their oars up and out of the way, the attacking ship is going to pin them against the side and snap them. And before they snap, the handles are going to swing against the rowers' benches. And that's going to be hard on the rowers. So these guys are going to want to have a drill where they practice shipping their oars just as fast as humanly possible. So what did these land battles at sea look like? Well, they were probably pretty quick and dirty, at least at the individual ship level. We've already established that these wouldn't have been equal fights. Bigger ships would pursue smaller ones, and one crew would board and overwhelm the other. And it wouldn't be large groups fighting. A ship with a crew of 50 guys might not have more than 10 available to board an enemy ship. The rowers would make up most of the crew, and at least one officer and a few guys would need to stay on the ship for two purposes. One, to fight off any boarders who tried to come up from the other side. And two, to sail the ship to safety if the worst happened and the boarding party was captured or wiped out. And the ships would have had to form up in some kind of battle lines, or at least teams of wingmen, to keep exactly that kind of thing from happening. Because a ship whose Marines have boarded another ship is uniquely vulnerable to somebody pulling up on the other side and boarding it. You need to have ships hanging back out of contact to threaten the enemy ships that would try to do that. Or you need to have enough ships to engage them before they can. And there's another complication we haven't mentioned yet, the difference between warships and cargo ships. Because even in the late Bronze Age, there would have been a difference. A warship would have been long and narrow, built for speed and agility, with more rowers to make the ship go where the captain wanted it to go in combat. A cargo ship, on the other hand, would be built to haul cargo. It'd be wider, with a deeper hull, fewer rowers, and it would have ridden lower in the water. It would have been slower and much more vulnerable to attack, and it and its cargo would have been the real prize of most battles at sea. Because piracy and loot were probably a big part of how the sea peoples enriched themselves. So the real conflict in most sea battles of this age would have been the attackers trying to get at the cargo ships, to steal them and their cargo, and to take out the defenders trying to stop them. Okay, so that's enough about how they would have fought, at least for now. Let's take a look at the Hittites. We're going to go fast and furious here for a minute, so bear with me. The Hittites were the dominant empire of Anatolia, the peninsula the Greeks called Asia Minor, and we call Turkey today. Their culture rose in about 1700 BCE, becoming an empire in about 1400. That empire controlled most of Anatolia, plus chunks of northern Mesopotamia and the Levant, for the next 200 years or so. The last Hittite king we met was Mursili II, who managed to keep his kingdom from shrinking with his victories at the Astarpa River and Ganuvara in the late 1300s BCE. His son was Muwatalli II, who fought the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II at Kadesh in 1274 BCE. Ramses claimed the victory in that fight, but he was the one who tucked tail and left the battlefield, so you be the judge. Hattusili III took the throne from Muwatalli's son, Mursili III, in a civil war around 1267 BCE. He drove Mursili out of Anatolia and down to Egypt. Hattusili seems to have finally consolidated Hittite control over all of Anatolia. Then his son, Tudaliya IV, took Alashiya, which archaeologists these days seem to agree was the island of Cyprus. This conquest would have been a huge deal. Not only did it extend the Hittite Empire to its greatest extent, but Alashiya was apparently the source of much of the copper used in the Near East. So now the Hittites controlled the copper. Good time to be a Hittite. After Tudaliya, things started to go downhill. He was overthrown by Kurunta, who only ruled for a short time before being overthrown himself, either by Tudaliya taking the throne back or by Tudaliya's son Arnuwanda III. Then Arnuwanda ruled over only a couple of years before his brother Suppiluliuma II took the throne in about 1207 BCE. And it was under Suppiluliuma II that today's war story went down. Now, we went through all that not to make things confusing, but to help you see that things were a little chaotic in the Hittite Empire in the late 1200s BCE. We're getting close to the Bronze Age collapse, and in fact, Suppiluliuma II is the last named great king of the Hittites that we know about. And by 1100 BCE, the Hittite Empire is going to be gone. So it was in Suppiluliuma II's reign that Alashiya revolted. What do we know about Alashiya? Not much, unfortunately. Archaeologists seem to mostly agree that Alashiya is Cyprus, and Cyprus has been settled for something like 13,000 years. But we don't know who the people who lived there were, or what Bronze Age culture they were related to. They might have been from Anatolia, or Canaan, or Mycenaean Greece, or even Minoan Greece, or someplace else. Maybe the Hittites knew, or maybe the Alashians knew, but we don't. What we do know is that a lot of the copper used in the Near East came from Cyprus. And copper, as you know, is the major component of bronze. And bronze, as you know, is the metal that allowed empires to rise and fall during the Bronze Age. So whoever controlled the copper would have been sitting pretty. It would have been a little like controlling a big chunk of the world's supply of lithium or titanium or cobalt today. And the Hittites controlled it from sometime around 1260 BCE until the island revolted around 1205. I haven't read that the revolt came at the same time Suppiluliuma II took the throne, but that would fit the typical pattern. Anytime a new ruler takes over from the old one, provinces that were already inclined to revolt might just make a go of it on the off chance they can get out before the new guy gets everything under control. So we're going to assume Suppiluliuma had to deal with Alashiya early in his reign, like in the first couple of years. The BS meter for this war story is about a 9 out of 10. I've had to make up pretty much all of the details. This battle probably happened, but that's about all we have. No shit. There they were. Suppiluliuma II was named for the greatest of Hittite great kings. His namesake, Suppiluliuma I, had basically invented the Hittite Empire back in the 1300s BCE and had defended it against all comers until he died in 1322. Since then, his successors had beaten back a series of bullies and shit-talkers and failed to stop at least 2 internal coups. And Suppiluliuma II was going to need every bit of good luck he could draw out of his name if he wanted to continue the streak. Other than the usual rumblings, the empire itself and the vassals in Mesopotamia and the Levant had been mostly quiet for a while. But new threats were showing up from a new direction, the west, over the water. Nobody knew anything about these sea peoples, but they were starting to make shipping across the Mediterranean a pain in the ass, showing up out of nowhere, killing crews and stealing ships and cargo, then disappearing back across the water. The Egyptians had had some success against them, but if Suppiluliuma wanted to be taken seriously as a great king, he couldn't go crawling to the Egyptians for help. He needed to find a way to deal with these sons of bitches himself. And things had just gotten even more serious because his brother Arnawanda III was barely in his grave, and the island of Alashiya was already in revolt. We don't have any way of knowing why. Maybe the Hittites were treating them unfairly, or maybe they wanted to be able to trade directly with the rest of the Mediterranean kingdoms, or maybe the sea peoples were stirring up shit. For our purposes, we're going to say the sea peoples were the instigators of the whole thing because it seems more likely that any sea battles in this period would have been against them, or at least involved them, than anybody else. So on the one hand, Suppiluliuma was inheriting the empire without bloodshed for the first time in quite a few years, and his advisors and vassals were all relieved not to have to fight another civil war to see who would get to rule. On the other hand, losing Alashiya would be a problem, because the copper from Alashiya was a significant source of wealth for the empire, and had been now for more than half a century, and the king who failed to hold on to it wasn't going to stay king for very long. There was just one problem. The Hittites were a mountain people. They had come up in the interior of Anatolia, and even though Anatolia was surrounded on three sides by water, the Hittites could find everything they needed without ever going near it. They were pretty good at fighting on land, and it wouldn't be a problem crossing the water to fight on land, but the sea peoples were going to want to fight out on the water, and that was a whole different animal. But he knew just who to call on. He had a vassal city called Ugarit on the Levantine coast, just a little north of the modern-day city of Latakia in Syria. Ugarit worked for the Hittites, and Ugarit had a navy. In fact, it had been the main port for the Hittites to move their copper from Alashiya into Mesopotamia for 50 years. Its king Amurapi had as much to lose from Alashiya's rebellion as Suppiluliuma himself. He would have to help. So the great king wrote to Amurapi, reminding him of his allegiance and asking him how he thought they should go about cracking this nut. And Amurapi's reply was promising. He had the ships, and his captains knew how to take on the sea peoples and anybody else who might come out of Alashiya by water. But he needed the Hittites to put some skin in the game too. He didn't want to sail his whole navy and army to Alashiya and leave his city unprotected, not at a time like this. He could supply the ships and the men to sail them, but he wanted the Hittites to supply the fighting men. Well, the Hittites weren't crazy about going by ship, but it was the only way to get where they needed to go. So they hitched up their britches and marched down to Ugarit. And Suppiluliuma, just like his famous namesake, marched at their head. But of course it wasn't as simple as just marching to Ugarit and getting on the ships. If the Hittite troops were going to sail to Alashiya and fight, and if they expected the sea peoples to try and stop them, they needed to know how to fight at sea. So they started going to sea, serving as Marines on warships and cargo ships. They got over their seasickness, learned how to move aboard a rolling ship, and many of them got some practice at fighting off raiders. The merchant captains were glad to have them. Extra guards who knew how to handle their weapons, who the captains didn't have to pay except for feeding them. That seemed like a pretty good trade. So after a month of training soldiers to be Marines, Suppiluliuma decided his guys were ready to get after it. And the fleet set out for Alashiya, 40 warships and a dozen troop transports. They didn't get very far on that first trip, because the thing about launching a massive fleet is that it takes up a lot of space on the water, and if you let it get stretched out, it'll be vulnerable. And Amurapi told Suppiluliuma all that, and Suppiluliuma was young and impatient, and they hadn't seen more than a few sea people ships together at a time all month. And he was ready to move on to the part where he had his island back. So they launched, and the sea people swarmed the lead ships before the last ships had even cleared the dock. And Suppiluliuma watched as 10 warships sailed away, their crews and his soldiers dead or taken prisoner. Shit. They spent a week planning before launching a second time. This time they were careful to keep the ships together in the harbor until everybody was ready to sail. So when they headed out into the open sea, it was in something that looked a lot like a line of battle. And the Sea People still kicked their asses. They fell on the right flank about 20 miles out to sea, taking 5 more ships before the rest of the fleet could maneuver against them. But Suppiluliuma noticed something. The Sea Peoples were avoiding the troop carriers and only hitting the warships, which made sense if you think about how they were fighting. A troop transport had a lot more fighting men on it than a warship. So if your basic ship-to-ship tactic was to board and fight until the guys on the ship surrendered, you wanted to be able to overwhelm them quickly instead of getting overwhelmed yourself. And the beginnings of a trick play started to form in his mind. The warships were faster than the troop carriers, but smaller. Easier for the bigger Sea People ships to overwhelm. So it made sense for him to hit the warships first, then the transports if they were stupid enough to stick around. But what if he could make a troop transport look like a juicy target? He sent part of his land force marching up around the Anatolian coast to the port of Tarsus with a letter to the governor telling him what he wanted. And the governor got to work. And 2 weeks later, 2 fleets set sail, one from Ugarit and one from Tarsus. The fleet from Ugarit looked a lot like the fleets that had gone out a couple of weeks earlier. 20 warships escorting 9 troop carriers. The smaller fleet from Tarsus had 10 warships escorting 6 cargo ships with covered loads. I'm pretty sure you can see where this is headed. The trip from Ugarit to the nearest port on Cyprus is about 100 miles. A respectable distance, especially in the Bronze Age. Especially for the Hittites, who probably wouldn't have been comfortable on the water even after several weeks of training. They would have lost sight of land 3 to 5 miles offshore, and the Hittites would have been at the mercy of their captains and of the Sea Peoples. They had worked with their captains long enough that they probably trusted them by this time, but the Sea Peoples had hit them every time they got more than 10 or 20 miles away from shore, because everybody involved knew that if the Hittites could get their army to Alashiya, they could take it back. So the Sea People's best play, their only play really, was to stop the Hittite ships before they could get to the island. And if everything went the way it was supposed to, Suppiluliuma was about to beat them at their own game. Both fleets were making their best speed, which may have been something between 5 and 9 knots, around 6 to 11 miles an hour. They would converge near the tip of the peninsula we call the Carpus today. But the Sea Peoples didn't know about the fleet from Tarsus because they were watching for the fleet from Ugarit, and they hit it just like they had the last 2 times. But this time, the Hittites didn't run. Suppiluliuma had beefed up his warship crews, replacing some of the rowers with soldiers and freeing and arming the others if they agreed to fight for him. And these fighting rowers had spent the last 2 weeks practicing one drill: ship their oars before the enemy ship could scrape the side, then grab their weapons and throw down. So when the Sea Peoples hit the Hittite warships, they pretty quickly discovered they weren't facing 10 or a dozen dudes, but 40 or 50. That was the first part of Suppiluliuma's trick play. The second part was the fleet from Tarsus, which came down from the north a little after the Sea Peoples had committed against the ships from Ugarit. So now the Sea Peoples found themselves under attack from the north, in addition to facing a fleet that wasn't running away the way it was supposed to. Okay, suboptimal for the Sea Peoples, but they knew how to adapt. They backed their ships off, the ones that could still escape, and turned away. And Suppiluliuma did not pursue, which would have been the wrong decision, except he knew where the Sea People's ships were going. Because to reinforce his main fleet, the warships from Tarsus had left the cargo ships they were protecting behind. The cargo ships that weren't carrying cargo, they were carrying soldiers. Well, 6 cargo ships without their escort made an irresistible target for the Sea Peoples. And a fleet that had already gotten its nose bloodied by a sucker punch from some 2-bit land king was not about to head home without a score. So they headed northeast to gobble up that nice little snack, which was exactly what Suppiluliuma wanted them to do. He sent his slow troop ships on toward Alashiya and turned northeast with his warships, swinging wide to hide his movement from the Sea Peoples. So the Sea Peoples got another 1-2 shock. Locked in combat with the cargo ships, which of course had turned out to be much harder targets than they had expected, they suddenly found warships swarming all around them. And out of 30 ships engaged at the beginning of the day, only 12 Sea Peoples ships made it back to their unknown bases across the Med. And Suppiluliuma got his troops to Alashiya, and they put down the rebellion and got the copper moving again. And as far as I know, Alashiya stayed loyal after that. Maybe because he left a large garrison on the island, but we have no way to know that. But there was no happily ever after for Suppiluliuma II, because as far as we know, he was the last great king of the Hittite Empire. There would still be peoples in Anatolia and northern Syria who called themselves Hittites for a few more centuries, and the Old Testament mentions Hittites a few times, so they may have had a cultural presence, or at least a tradition, well into the Iron Age. But by the mid-800s BCE, we don't hear any more about Hittites. Hattusa was sacked and burned in 1180 BCE, and Suppiluliuma II may have been killed there, or maybe not. We don't actually know when he died, or whether anybody tried to assume the throne after him. Amurapi also ruled until about 1180 BCE, which is about when Ugarit was destroyed, maybe by the Sea Peoples. As for the Sea Peoples themselves, we don't really know who they were, or where they came from, or where they went. The Bronze Age cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean started to encounter them in the 1200s BCE. And by about 1100, most of those cultures were gone. But did the Sea Peoples destroy them? A lot of people smarter than me say they did, and a lot of people smarter than me say they didn't. I don't think we'll ever know for sure, but it seems unlikely to me. But we'll get more into that as we move through the Bronze Age collapse. Today, we wanted to talk about Suppiluliuma's naval victory at Alashiya. And look, we did it! And of course, with a BS meter of 9 out of 10, we're not doing a scorecard this time. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this war story, please give me a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to tell your friends about me, especially that one you just thought of when I said that. Now, somebody asked me a few days ago why I always close with piss when you can. So since it's a new year, here's the story. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, was the guy who defeated Napoleon once and for all at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. I heard a story once, don't remember where, that before the battle, some of his troops asked him for some words of encouragement for the coming fight. And Wellington, being a man of few words, told them, "Piss when you can." I found that to be good advice in the Army, and it's remained good advice in civilian life. I shared it with my kids and with my scouts when I was a scout leader and with other young people I work with in other areas. So I pass it on to you with each war story in hopes that you'll find it as useful as I do. So until next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one.